Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay Newton, and I am the Director of Community Engagement at the Missouri Historical Society. Thank you for joining us virtually today for STL History Live. We are so glad to be here. Welcome. I know that some of you watching today are Missouri Historical Society members. Thank you. We are so grateful for your support. And if you are not a member, we would love for you to consider joining today. You can see a link to our website in the chat box. We also sincerely thank our city and county residents for your tax contributions through the Zoo Museum Tax District. All of the support is greatly appreciated. So today's presentation will be roughly 20 minutes long, followed by 10 minutes for questions and answers. We will be using our question and answer button, the Q&A button in your toolbar. And we would prefer you wait until the end after the presentation to start typing in those questions just so that we are sure not to miss them. And we will do our best, but we may not have time to get to all of your questions. And lastly, closed captioning is being provided today. Again, you have a toolbar and you can scroll over the closed caption button to turn on that feature. So now I'm going to turn this over to our speaker. Today's talk, Hidden in Plain Sight, is presented by our Community Tours Manager, Amanda Clark. Enjoy.
Thank you, Lindsay. Hello, everybody. As Lindsay said, my name is Amanda Clark, and I am the Community Tours Manager, a program that once we're all able to hang out in person means that I will be taking you on walking and eventually bus tours of different neighborhoods and featuring different topics and themes, and hopefully showing people a side of St. Louis that they have never seen before. And we're going to do that today on this program. Today's program is Hidden in Plain Sight. It's going to last about, like she said, about 20 minutes. And it was totally inspired by my love of exploring every single nook and cranny of this city. Every single nook and cranny of the city and finding buildings that are off the beaten path and that have great history attached to them. None of the buildings in my presentation today are necessarily landmarks. They're not buildings that are in guidebooks. They're nothing that you're going to see big presentations given on, except for this one, until today. So many of them, for a couple of them, this is their first time out, actually being shown off. And some of them aren't buildings. Some of them are structures that we pass every day and have no idea what giant history they actually connect us to and to the history of our bigger city. So instead of driving around in a bus or walking around on a foot, today we're going to kind of fly around the city and we're going to drop in on some really cool little hidden spots in all spots of the city. I've got some a little bit in downtown, University City, and South St. Louis as well. But first, a teaser and a kind of riddle. The building that's on the screen there is a building that none of us have ever seen, and yet it is one that all of us have seen. If you live in St. Louis, you literally can't miss it. If you've ever seen a picture of the arch, can't miss this building, but yet none of us have ever seen it unless you've seen a photograph. And I promise to do a big reveal of just what building this is at the end. Before we get to your buildings, I couldn't help but do a little overview of the city. So here we have the riverfront, and I want to do a little overview of the great transformation that has happened in downtown St. Louis. Not only are we going to fly around today, but we're also going to time travel. So I need you to get in a time traveling mindset. And that's what this little thing is going to do. So we have turn of the century, St. Louis riverfront, up as close to the river as possible. The city's really, we'd be in the water if we could. And then you see in the 20th century, you see a change over to this, which is in the late 1960s, you have the arch that's just been built, you have the Old Bush Stadium, and up to the north, you see the Pruitt-Igoe public housing, federal housing project. So all big, huge things and a big is a great image of St. Louis before it looks like it does today. So as I said, throughout the program, we're going to visit about 4 or 5 other sites, and none of them are going to be as big and encompassing as this image. So let's head off on our very first flight. Okay, and as all things in St. Louis should do, they start at the Arch, and then we're going to go from there. So we're going to head down into South St. Louis, into not quite to Carondelet, but almost. And we are going to go to this very unassuming building here. Move in, just kind of zoom in a little bit, kind of get you up close. You can see it. So you'd be on, if you were looking at this building, we'd be standing on Broadway, looking towards the river. So the river is on the other side of that building. There's a bluff, and you'd be looking over into Illinois. So we're settled in front of what is now known as the Geithner Home. It is a senior living facility. It has been known as the Geithner Home since 1939. And it has but the building itself has a huge connection to not only St. Louis sports history, but Olympic history as well. So let's time travel back to the 1930s. We're gonna fly one more time down there. There we go. So we're gonna time travel to the 1930s. And this is the building as it looked before it was the Geithner Home. What you're looking at is the last of the major clubhouse boathouses for the Western Rowing Club. So around 1860s actually, St. Louis started getting rowing clubs. And so this was an Eastern sport. You know, St. Louis is considered one of the last East Coast cities, and rowing is definitely one of those East Coast sports, or one that is normally associated with Philadelphia, New York, Boston. Well, St. Louis was on a national stage when it came to rowing as well. And we had up to 9 teams at one time, different clubhouses, boathouses. One of them, the St. Louis Rowing Club, founded in 1875, is still active. You can still be a member, and they row on Creve Coeur Lake. So the building we were looking at was the last of the boathouses and clubhouses for the Western Rowing Club. The Western Rowing Club was one of the more successful of all of the rowing clubs that we had. They rowed in 1901. They were the national champions in several different amateur races. So, you know, the races are broken down by 8-man, 4-man, different things like that. Whenever they would have a regatta, which is, you know, the races on the Mississippi River, there would be up to 4,000 to 5,000 people lining the riverfront to watch these races. And a neat little piece of the rowing history is that the big cups, the big trophies, the 2 big ones were actually provided by the beer barons. And so there was a Faust Cup and a Limp Cup. And there was even one where you know, one of the big brewers bet $100 that their Western Rowing Club couldn't make it across the river in 2 minutes, and they did. And so he had to pay them up. There's a really interesting connection to beer history in St. Louis and rowing. So the painting you're seeing there is the first boathouse down on the river. And then later they moved into the building that we saw. The boats would have been held closer to the river. And the big boathouse that we saw in the image before had bowling alleys and dance hall and, you know, places to have events and things like that. So you see a ribbon towards the bottom, and that's where the Western Rowing Club placed in the World's Fair Regatta. Of the 4 teams that raced in the 1904 World's Fair rowing events, 3 of them were from St. Louis, and those were the Mound City and the St. Louis Rowing Club and the Western Rowing Club. You also had Central Rowing Club, you had the Modoc, you had a huge list of them. Can't tell, I'm a little obsessed with rowing in St. Louis. However, the Olympic events were not held on the Mississippi River. They were held at Creve Coeur Lake. When researching this, I found a great Post-Dispatch editorial about why St. Louis was a strange city for rowing. And one of the reasons it gave was that the water was just too muddy and the riverfront didn't have any parks on it. But we had all of these men that were returning, you know, from East Coast colleges and universities, and they wanted to continue their sports. And people stayed active into this. The Western Rowing Club, they went under in the 1940s. That's when most of their members were off to war. And so the club was disbanded. Then there was talk a little bit after the World War about reviving the club, but that did not happen. Just again, to compare those two buildings, this is one of those finds that I was looking for something totally unrelated. And when I found this, I jumped out of my chair because I love finding these little pieces of history hiding. Okay, so let's head off on our next flight. This one is also going to take us into South St. Louis. And unexpectedly, it's also going to take us to some Olympic history. Unexpected. That was unintended. So now we are in Dutchtown, and you're looking at the St. Alexius Hospital. Zoom in here, this bright yellow building. This bright yellow building I found when I was researching one of the last programs I gave on St. Louis medical history. Across the street from this building is a Lutheran hospital. And when I was studying that building, couldn't help but notice this bright yellow thing and want to know what the story is on that. So when I looked at the address, I found that I was looking at the Southwest Turnverein at Potomac in Ohio. If you're not familiar with the phrase the term Turnverein, it is a reference, a German-American gymnastics club at its heart, and there were several scattered throughout St. Louis neighborhoods, since we were a center for a large German population. And those that belonged to Turnvereins are called Turners, and they were a major part of the German-American experience. Not only did they provide community, but also classes, fitness, and meeting spaces. Many of the individual Turnvereins had their own teams. They would compete against each other, which is where we come to the 1904 Olympics. Again, this was unintended, but most things in St. Louis history make their way to 1904. So I couldn't find any images of this building, so I decided we would time travel within Google Maps there. All right, so at the Olympic history connection is that the Southwest Turnvereins team for the tug of war competition in the 1904 Olympics, they took home the silver and the bronze medals. They went up against New York, they made their way through the competition, and so they were medalists, and the actual competition itself was contested, and they were then gold medalists. So and then an extra cool thing about this is that one of their team members, a man named Frank Kugler, is still the only man to medal in 3 different sports at an Olympic Games. So he's there in that picture somewhere, and he was from the Southwest Turnverein. Okay, so we're gonna leave this bright yellow building again in Ohio and Potomac in Dutchtown, and we're going to fly a little bit north from here. So we're going to go close to Soulard, between the Soulard neighborhood and downtown St. Louis. Right here. Now this is one of those things that, like I said, this is the first time it's being brought out. About 8 or 9 years ago, I was on a walk down the street, and I noticed that plaque over to the left. And while I couldn't get in close enough on Google Maps to show you what it says, we're going to go somewhere else for our time travel, and I will explain the plaque. Okay, so many of us are familiar with kind of these decrepit train tracks that are downtown. They're passing over. If you're at a ball game, you may see them. Time travel back to the turn of the century. So you're looking at the Municipal Bridge in the distance that was built after the Eads Bridge. That was meant to be the free bridge. So the plaque that I found that's nestled underneath one of these overpasses, it commemorates in 1953 the completion of elevated tracks and grade crossing projects throughout the city. As a modern St. Louisan, I had to kind of wrap my head around what a grade crossing meant. A grade crossing is where a train, whether a freight train, passenger train, slow moving train, it's where it crosses at street level. This was a major problem throughout American cities, and it still is something that is a bit of a concern, but nothing like it was in early St. Louis and into the mid 20th century. And these are just a few of the images I was able to find in in historic newspapers. Every year you would see a plea for the city to provide money to either elevate tracks or to lower tracks and build a bridge over them. As that movement pushed forward in 1920, there was a bond issue passed that provided a good amount of money to get this done. But what is an interesting thing is that actually went to court. All of these things went to court, and there were lawsuits between the railroad companies and the city. And the root of those lawsuits was, who's going to pay for this? Whose fault is it? Is it the train that hits the car, or is it the car that drives in front of the train? So who is responsible for this cost that it's going to take? So ultimately, that kind of got divided depending on the crossing. So those crossings that you see that we initially saw downtown are kind of quiet now and no longer an issue. The one that you're seeing on the right there, that image, that historic image of the two cars waiting there, that is at Delmar and Hodiamont. So now you might recognize, this is one of the most dangerous crossings that was actually the site of several very deadly wrecks, not just automobiles, but streetcars, things like that. And what would happen is not just that a car would race a train, that happened as well, but you may have one train coming for a long time passing in front of your automobile. And when it passes and you think it's ready, you're ready to go, another train would be coming the opposite direction really fast. And that would have caused a lot of the accidents. So that historic image that I showed before, that Wabash and Delmar crossing, was solved in the early 20th century by the Wabash train station that you're seeing here. They created a viaduct over the train. The Metrolink red line runs underneath here. They touted at the time when they did this building project that they did not spend any, they did not slow down a single train in building that station and that viaduct for the trains to run under. The image in the upper right that you see there are double-decker buses and streetcars running along that viaduct along Delmar Avenue, and there is the station in the lower right. I'm going to kind of give you an image. If you're not really familiar with what you're looking at, I'm going to pivot us east, looking towards downtown. This is pretty common for St. Louisans. This is a spot that's very easy to drive past and see on a regular basis. Okay, so for our next spot, we're going to not fly very far. We're actually just going to fly up Delmar just a little bit. And this one was one that just blew me away, like when I found it. Again, this is the first time I've seen it mentioned anywhere, and I can't believe that we didn't know this, or that I didn't know this. So this building here, driven past it a million times, headed up and down Delmar. Looks like a nondescript apartment building with some retail on the lower levels. What it is though, it's the Delmont or Del Monte Theater, and it was built in 1920. It was a silent movie theater with a hotel on top. And the reason that this is cool and historic is that it was at the time the largest single level, so the theater was on that lower level, it's the largest in the world, and it seated 3,000 people in its auditorium in the movie house. You can see it in that lower left image there. In the middle, you see the Delmont Hotel and Theater. It was furnished fully by Stix, Bauer and Fuller, which is one of the original St. Louis department stores. It was also a site for many fashion shows. And the image on the right shows the very first, was the thing that opened the theater, and that was humoresque, and it was written by Fannie Hurst, which was a St. Louis playwright as well. Okay, head to our next flyaway here. For this one, I'm going to fly north and take you here. Oh no, we're gonna fly south. So flying down back to Soulard area to this, most people know this as the Smile Soda Factory building. It's at 9th and Allen. This is a Google Maps image. I do not believe that it's under construction anymore. So what's cool about this, and this is not going to be one where there was a big history, although it has a really cool history of connecting. It was originally for a beer garden there, then it was the home of the Czechoslovakian gymnasium society, kind of like the Turnvereins, except it's called a Sokol, S-O-K-O-L. And then after that, it was the Smile Soda Factory. Now I believe there are lofts there and offices. But the little history we're going to find in this one, it's another one of those really cool ones for me. Okay, so you see this picture here. This is from 1896. This is footage from the 1896 cyclone, the Great Cyclone that flew through South St. Louis, claiming over 330 lives, still considered one of the deadliest and costliest natural disasters to hit an American city, and is a big piece of South St. Louis history. So it makes its way through the Soulard neighborhood and does, flattens neighborhoods, flattens parks, and causes a huge loss of life. Here's some damage to that, what's called the Bohemian Gymnasium. And you can see that, that kind of half crescent shaped damage there on the front. If you were looking at the building up close now, you see underneath that second level windows, you see the curve of those bricks, and you can see the exact shape of that repair. Things like this, while it seems minor, to me, it was very moving when I found it, because it connected me to St. Louisans living 130 years ago. And it was just, right there was some evidence of the damage and the repairs. Okay, let's move on to our next one. We're going to fly from here. Now we are really going to go way north, and this is not a building that we are headed to. This is a very unassuming little spot. So we're going to Bellefontaine Cemetery, one of the best places in St. Louis to get lost and to find some history. Because while you can go there and see the graves of famous St. Louisans, it is often fun to just kind of get lost there, and you will find some stuff that you never expected, such as this. So about a year ago, I was wandering around with a friend in Bellefontaine, and we were just, reading off names and kind of, having a fun time looking at some of the older names and things. And I caught sight of this strange looking monument off in the distance. So I made my way to the monument, kind of in the middle of nowhere. And on one side, you see, and you probably hard to read in the middle there, you see in memory of one Joseph White. So this was Joseph White's grave. It was at the Presbyterian Church in downtown St. Louis. That's kind of out of place. So you go to the other side of the monument, and you see that this monument was removed from the old Presbyterian burial ground on Franklin Avenue and Washington Street. And beneath it are posited all of the human remains found there in November 1865, when they were removed according to an act of the legislature. What? So that's what I said when I found this. So I had to research and find more about this. So in 1865, the city cleared out the city cemeteries downtown, moved them further west. In 1865, you're not too far after, some of those big cholera epidemics. So most of the people that were buried in these cemeteries were cholera victims. That's going to come into the next thing, which is when I researched this, the only article I could find or any piece of information was in the New York Times. They covered the fact that the men that were hired to move these bodies from this particular cemetery out to Bellefontaine, they were allowed to keep whatever they found on the bodies as kind of payment for what they were doing. So if most of these people died during cholera, they would have been buried in their clothing with whatever possessions they had on their body, because no one wanted to touch them, in case they would be contaminated. So a lot of these people, this is not a time when you would have all of your money in the bank or, a check card or things like that. You would have everything, sewn to your clothing or on your body as much as you possibly can. So the gravedigger, or the men that moved these bodies, found French coins, they found gold, they found watches, they found all kinds of things on these bodies, and they were allowed to keep them as payment. And one of the most interesting graves they found was a large metal casket with a glass top with a, not, as I said, not too, there There was a woman inside who was in good condition, as the paper said, and she was covered in an extravagant gold outfit. It turns out she was an actress that was killed on stage when a beam fell on her and she was buried. And initially the men said, we have $5,000 worth of stuff on this lady, we don't know what to do. And it turns out it was all costume jewelry. So that is the last of the places that, one of my favorite little secret finds out in Bellefontaine. And here's the teaser, here we are. So as I'm gonna end and then we'll open up for the Q&A. And after the Q&A, everybody, we do have a poll for you to complete, and your feedback is super important to us. Okay, so this is the Pierce building. You're downtown at Chestnut Street. If you were looking at this building at the turn of the century, behind you would be the old courthouse, and to the right you couldn't see anything because you'd be looking at a wall of buildings headed down to the river. Because what you are looking at is now the Hyatt. So that is the original building, but it is clad in a more modern material. This was done in the late 20th century and the two wings that are on the back were added to have all of the mechanical, electrical, engineering, plumbing, things like that. So you're looking at a historic building that's been covered up and is in hiding in downtown St. Louis. So that is my presentation on Hidden in Plain Sight. Again, this presentation could have taken days to do. There's so many, and it was fun to find things that I challenged myself to find things that were not found in any other books about things that are hidden in St. Louis. So again, I'm going to head to the Q&A now to see what interesting stuff. Share here. I see that someone was very excited about that I found the Southwest Turner Hall. 3 exclamation points, that's how I felt as well. Doug Schneider, great question there about the glass-topped coffin. It is not known that she was afraid of being buried alive, but that since she was buried in her stage clothing, I'm feeling that was something that was part of that, to see her beauty. Okay. Someone has a question about whether Bellefontaine and the Calvary cemeteries are still open right now to drive through, and they are. I joke that when your job involves hanging out with interesting dead people, that comes in handy when you can't hang out with live people right now. So they are open during the day. You can walk through. It's about a 4-mile walking trail around Bellefontaine. You can walk and drive through both of those during the day. And do I know the name of the actress? I do not know her name off the top of my head, but I can look it up for sure. I have it in my research, and I can respond to that question and send you an email. And I have another question about the actress and what she was performing in which theater. And those are all things that are in my notes, but the presentation was a little too short for that. So I will email anyone who's asking about her and get that information. And I have one of how do you research these buildings and how could I research different buildings? I research them several different ways. Whenever I see an address mentioned in an older text, so a newspaper article or in a book, or I do a lot of city directory reading, a lot of newspaper city guides. I have tours of St. Louis from the 1870s, things like that. And I'll see little references to things and I'll research that address. And those are all things that I can do at the Missouri Historical Society Library, not just when it's open, but you can research a lot of this online now through the online collections. The St. Louis Public Library also has a phenomenal online collection that you can look for a lot of these buildings, as well as the Mercantile Library and newspapers.com. Someone asked about the plaque. The plaque is from 1953, and they're kind of patting themselves on the back for completing this project. But that started in the early 20th century. So 1920 is when the bond issue is passed that pays for the major amount of these upgrades. Okay, I think that is, I'm not seeing any new questions. There are lots of good ones. If I wasn't able to answer it, I may be able to look up those answers for you. And if you have any questions afterwards, you can always reach out to me at aclark@mohistory.org. There should be a poll that you'll receive after the presentation. And again, your feedback is really, really important and useful. And there's the poll. Hi, Lindsay.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much, Amanda, for sharing that history with us today. And I did just launch a poll. Thank you all for being here with us for STL History Live. Again, we're so excited to be doing this series, and they are happening a few times each week. We would love for you to join us next time. The next one is Thursday evening at 6 p.m. We're doing Hollywood versus History. Alelia Bundles, who is the great-great-granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker, and Linda Nance, who's the founding president of the Annie Malone Historical Society, will discuss Self-Made, which is the recent Netflix series I'm sure many of you have had the opportunity to watch in the last few weeks. It explores the life of Madam C.J. Walker and sheds light on the power of African-American women as entrepreneurs and business leaders. So again, that is Thursday evening at 6 p.m. And as Amanda was saying, we have polls, and also your feedback is just so important to us. So we have set up a survey today. The survey will automatically come up on your screen when we end the session. So if you would just wait for a 5-second countdown, you will see it come up in a new tab. You'll have to navigate to that tab, and it'll take just a couple of moments to answer some questions for us. Again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.